This presentation is a very brief overview of children's physical activity, and particularly thinking about how we go about discussing physical activity within children, and also thinking about the guidelines that are currently available for the physical activity levels of children. A little bit about trends in physical activity at the moment. What's in the presentation? We answer a few questions. So why are we interested in physical activity and sedentary behaviour of children? Think about the important terminology. Look at the current guidelines across the age ranges. We think about how we might interpret these guidelines. Are people actually giving us some help, some recommendations of what we might be doing? How is the evidence developed to support these guidelines? And very briefly, what are the current trends in children's physical activity across the globe? Why? Why really are we interested in physical activity of children? I'm sure you know most of this, but here we go. Quite a lot of it's common sense, but we think to ourselves, well, physical activity, what's it related to? There's moderate to strong evidence of the health benefits in children. Thinking about bone health, cognitive function, cardiovascular fitness, muscle fitness, weight status, depression. Now, here we're obviously talking about children, but if we think about the types of behaviours that you develop when you're a child, it's quite possible, and there's some evidence to show that these lead to behaviours when you're adults and on to older adulthood. So if in adulthood health, physical activity is related to a number of outcomes, and it's possible that it would be good as a child to develop good habits in terms of physical activity engagement. So in adults, we're looking at much wider implications of low levels of physical activity, all-cause mortality, strokes and heart conditions, hypertension, type 2 diabetes, cancers, depression, so mental health is a big one there, etc., etc., etc. So physical activity is obviously very important, particularly in children starting out as you mean to go on in life. What is the purpose of developing guidelines? This is a quote from the World Health Organization. So this is global recommendations on physical activity for health. This is back in 2010, but they're very similar, more recent updates to this. What's the point? Well, say down here, highlighted in red, the primary prevention of non-communicable diseases through physical activity at population level. So that's the focus of the document. So what they're looking for is to stop people getting these sort of secondary complications, for example, diabetes, type 2, complications that come from being too heavy, so being overweight, cardiovascular problems that people develop in later life. So that's the purpose of these recommendations, to try and provide people with guidance as to how much physical activity they should be doing for their own health. So I think it's important we cover very briefly terminology used in physical activity guidelines. What's the meaning of these various concepts, particularly in relation to children? And when we talk about physical activity, this is to do with bodily movement produced by skeletal muscles that require energy expenditure. Yes, quite straightforward and sensible. We've got to be a little bit cautious there when we talk about this in terms of children. If we're talking about very young children, perhaps when we talk about physical activity, we get this idea that physical activity is to do with something like exercise or physical education or sport. Whereas actually very young children, sort of 0 to 4 sort of age, preschool ages, they might not do that. They might just do stuff, energetic play. So perhaps the concepts are might be a little bit challenging to make sure we've got a uniform idea of the way we talk about the activity that people engage in. So in the guidelines that have been developed, physical activity is a terminology that is used. Different levels of physical activity, and these are formal definitions. So we've got the idea of sort of moderate physical activity. Here's a definition of that. So it's a number of multiples of energy expenditure of your sort of resting rate, and there's a little illustration here, the type of activities this might involve. Vigorous activity, doing more than that, really building up a bit of a sweat, getting hot. And here we're talking about moving to the upper ends of the intensity range that you might consider performing activity at. Note that the numbers here are slightly different for younger children compared to older children. So here is a summary. We might have moderate and vigorous activity. You see here, we might even get more categories. We might have very vigorous activity. We might then go, well, so sedentary activity on this bottom end, what's that? We'll see in a moment. Light activity in between. So we can categorize things in all sorts of different ways and say to ourselves what's good for us and how much of each of these categories is good for us. As I said, sedentary behaviour. What does that mean? More formally, this has recently been more formally defined, and this includes a definition which is anything that you're doing when you're awake, but you're doing very little because you're not actually expending much energy, but you're also sitting down or reclining or lying down. So lots of the screen watching activities would come within these categories, but also sitting down and reading, for example. We have to be a bit careful with our definitions here because we can also talk about physical inactivity, and this is not necessarily the same as sedentary behaviour. It's simply people who are not physically active enough, or that's how we might like to think about it, and perhaps it's people who are not meeting the physical activity guidelines. So guidelines for physical activity and sedentary behaviour. So what's recommended for us for our health? We might have to think about differences between different children, and you might think that there will be differences in terms of recommendations for these different age groups. So we've got preschool kids. They haven't got necessarily very scheduled lives. It might be a bit variable between days. We then move on to primary school children. These are rough age ranges, the primary school ages and high school, secondary school. There's different age groups in different countries. But at primary school, you start to do more regulated things like sitting during set times during the day, having set breaks, etc. And this is particularly the case at high school, where you're expected to spend a lot of time sitting, learning. So there's differences here. This is the children this is thinking about school time. What about after school, before school, after school? What are they doing then? How are they getting to school? What are they doing in their breaks? So all these things are to think about, particularly in terms of how we might specify the expectations of physical activity in these groups. Well, actually, the guidelines, and these are from the World Health Organization. These are quite recent guidelines, 2019. Here we have for preschoolers. So we've got different ones. We've got, quite interestingly, we've got a tummy time recommendation for physical activity for less than 1-year-olds. So this is saying, okay, don't leave your kid lying on the back the whole time. Make them do stuff. Make them lie on the front and waggle their arms and legs about. This is good for them. And then we've got children 1 to 2 years of age. We're starting to move up to quite a lot of activity here. So we're saying that we really expect them to be doing up to, or a minimum of 3 hours, 180 minutes of some form of activity, physical activity, each and every day. In other words, they really should be doing a lot of activity. And then children 3 to 4 years, there's an addition there of 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous, and this is where we talk about these categories where the child's starting to get out of breath, they're starting to really work quite hard in doing their activities. You'll also note here that there are screen time recommendations and sleep recommendations in these groups. So when we talk about physical activity, we've got a sort of holistic approach. We're thinking about what people do, what people do in terms of their very sedentary activity, and also sleep as a component of that behaviour. So these are recommendations. We move up to the older age group, so 5 to 18. So actually the recommendations, so this is from the UK Chief Medical Officer. It's similar on international guidelines. Very much what they're saying here is that within this age group, the evidence suggests across all of these age groups we should be aiming for these sort of outcomes, which is moderate vigorous physical activity, MVPA, of at least 60 minutes per day, so across the week. We're looking at doing this under a variety of different intensities and physical activity types. We're looking to minimise the amount of time that people spent sedentary. So we've got a physical activity recommendation, and we've got a recommendation on to minimise sedentary behaviours. So you can see this is a sort of quite general recommendations, but quite easy to understand. You should be doing an hour's worth of activity each and every day, and you should be doing lots of different things, and you should be minimising the amount of time you sit around doing nothing. It's very nice that these days people present the recommendations in terms of infographics. So here we have an example of one. This is coming from the UK Chief Medical Officer. This is for 5 to 18, so as in the previous slide. We have benefits up the top, so people go, yes, why am I doing this? Well, I'm doing for all these benefits. What am I doing? Well, the core message is 60 minutes a day, and you can do that doing all these sort of activities. Here's some illustrations. What else? Oh, I can be physically active. Right, be physically active. That's what we mean. Get strong, move more, and also there's a message, a subsidiary message in there saying, stop this inactivity. Stop sitting on the sofa. Well, actually, what they really mean here is reduce your sedentary time. But the message can be got across perhaps more effectively by saying reduce inactivity time. So that's a way of getting this information across to your target audience, the children and the educators involved of those children. How can we interpret them? Well, there's some recommendations, and indeed the guidelines that I've just talked about. There's some recommendations. So there's just a couple of slides here with some points. You can read through these in your own time, but just some key bits. So this is from Australia. The Australian recommendations: 5 to 12-year-olds shouldn't spend more than 2 hours a day sedentary. If you're starting to get more active, then start like this and do this. What does it mean? It means to huff and puff and do stuff. So any sort of active play is good for you. A variety of activities, and they've got a range of health benefits, including enhancing your experiences and presenting you with challenges. Holistic sort of approach again. From Canada, 6 to 9-year-olds, so this sort of younger age group. Physical activity is fun and it's healthy. Increased time currently spent on physical activity. Now what they're saying here in this age group is to really crank up the physical activity. So we're talking about changing it in adding 30 minutes a day, doing something extra for 30 minutes. So this younger age group, we're really looking for quite a lot of physical activity. And there's indications of how you might do that in stepwise, perhaps is the best way to do it. And try and combine various things like endurance, flexibility and strength in the activities. I suppose that means select activities that include endurance, flexibility and strength. And again, at the end, reduce screen time, starting by chopping it by 30 minutes a day. So some recommendations. And the next lot is just for slightly older kids. Again, range of activities: be active with your friends, walk more, limit time spent doing various sedentary screen-based activities, be active with friends and family, encourage and support other people within your family, try a new sport, take a class, check out other local facilities, put on some music and dance. Where does this evidence come from for the guidelines? A couple of different ways you can get this information. One is through questionnaires, and these are very simple means of collecting information on the physical activity of children. So what you do is you ask them about their physical activity. So here's an example. So for example, the number of days a week that you are active for at least 60 minutes, for example, or here's a little extract from a questionnaire. You get the children to fill this in, and then you also monitor their health and various health indicators, and you look at the relationship between the two, and this gives you an idea about what this means in terms of the physical activity levels compared to the health outcomes. Alternatively, you could stick monitors onto people, use body-worn monitors. Typically these are accelerometers, all variety of all different sort of monitors you can stick all over the place, and you get some information out. You tend to get information on people's movements and what they're doing, or you can get more specific information about their particular activities, whether they're sitting, standing or stepping, for example. And this information can be used then to make judgments about whether or not people are doing enough physical activity, or again it can be related to the health outcomes of the children doing specific levels of physical activity as measured with these measurement devices. So what is the evidence that the guidelines are based on? Well, we're using either self-report or we're using body-worn monitors, objective monitors, and what we're doing is reporting that and writing that up as reports. And then what the bodies like the World Health Organization and the chief medical officers do is look at all the evidence. So they do a systematic review of all the literature and they find out what the best current knowledge is and they use that. And based on that, they've come up with strong recommendations. That means it's desirable. The outcome from enhancing your physical activity levels is desirable, and the possible harm that might come from not doing that or actually doing too much physical activity, for example, is very, very minimal. So they say do more is really going to be, on the balance of things, very good for you. You could talk about how good it is for you. So, for example, infants, improving motor development, reducing adiposity in children, very small children, young children, improved motor and cognitive development and fitness. And, of course, we've shown, or just illustrated before, that in children there's all sorts of health benefits which might then lead on to adulthood and older adults. So then, very briefly, what we've got these recommendations. We know how we're going to sort of measure and monitor these, what children are doing. We've got an idea about what we're asking them to do. We know what the definitions we're using. But what are they actually doing? What are children actually doing at the moment? So here's a very brief couple of examples. We start off with quite a depressing picture, really, of the levels of insufficient physical activity. So in other words, these are the proportions of children who are not meeting the global recommendations for good for levels of physical activity for good health. These couple of slides here are based on very big, large studies, pulling in information from a lot of studies, a lot of countries, and you can see here that, well, the starting point is sort of 75%ish, but a lot of the countries that are on this map here are indicating that the level of insufficient activity is 75, 85, over 90%. There's not many over 90%, just a couple. But a lot of children are not reaching the levels of physical activity that they should do in order to optimize their health. This is boys, and a similar picture for girls. In fact, worse for girls. They tend to be more in the higher ranges of the insufficient physical activity. So it appears that across the globe, generally children aren't doing enough activity to optimize the sort of health benefits that they might get from physical activity. What happens across the ages? So very briefly here, this is a study using body-worn monitors in the UK. This shows that physical activity generally tends to reduce this is from sort of 7-8-year-olds through to 15-16-year-olds, and this has been known for quite a while, that in general we get less physical activity as we get older, sort of in our childhood years, and this is not good for us. It's leading to a lack of physical activity, which means we don't meet the guidelines, which means we're much more likely to be less healthy than we might have been had we met the guidelines. So what I've done here is given you a very brief overview of various aspects of physical activity in children. But just to emphasise a few points, there are obviously health benefits of meeting physical activity guidelines. We're having to use specific terms within these guidelines to be able to describe what we mean by physical activity and sedentary behaviour. Moderate to vigorous physical activity, these are sort of key terms here. And there are international guidelines which are important because we need to know sort of where we are, how we're getting on in terms of thinking about health benefits, healthy levels of physical activity. There's guidance to interpret those. It's all over the place. There's huge numbers of studies looking at how you can try and encourage people to be more physically active. It's based on evidence, so it's based on studies where we've looked at what people actually do and seen how healthy they are or not. And so what we're doing is we're saying, well, yeah, we've got a whole set of guidelines. We know how we should be implementing them, but so what do people actually do at the moment? Well, it does seem as though in general children's physical activity decreases as they get older, but really quite a lot of children are not meeting the physical activity guidelines. In fact, we'd probably say fewer than 3 out of 10 children across the world are actually meeting the physical activity recommendations, and therefore we're really sitting on a sort of ticking time bomb of ill health in children moving through to young adults to adults. So we have to think about how we might address that. So I hope that's given you a brief introduction to physical activity in children. Obviously it is only a brief introduction. Some of the sources that I've indicated as references will help you find out more, and it's worth having a look at the full documents of the recommendations and guidance that are available through the World Health Organization, through national bodies as well. They give you a much better, they'll give you a good broad range of material to have a look at to find out more about what these recommendations mean and how they might be used and implemented in various situations.